Before everything had escalated to this, I was planning a trip with both of my parents to the Caribbean islands. You see, my family is kinda rich, the kind that can afford to rent out a private jet when they go on vacations, and that's exactly what we did. On the 1st of October, we packed our stuff and were ready to enjoy an adventurous weekend. I didn't pack much. In fact, I didn't need much. Just some clothes and my special parachute suit, which I always take with me on every vacation if I ever feel like parachuting. I could honestly tell you guys that parachuting is the thing that gets me excited the most. The sensation, flying in the air, can't be compared to any other feeling in the world. In most cases, my father jumps with me, and we land together on the island. However, this time, things kinda took a different turn. As I was getting ready to jump, I stood near the door of the jet waiting for my father, as he was getting ready to join. When I looked down, I could see that we were almost near the land, and I was getting really excited to jump. The view looked so amazing. So I took out my phone from my jacket pocket and took a picture. But that's when something happened that took me off guard. My phone slipped from my hand, and I quickly leaned forward without thinking, hoping I would catch it. You could probably assume that at that point, what I did was very stupid because it had caused me to lose my balance and trip off the jet. Oh my God! I couldn't believe this was actually happening to me at the moment. Everything was so quick that I couldn't even utter a word or scream for help, and I started falling as I heard my parents screaming my name. I took a deep breath to calm myself down. And I just thought that I'll do what I always do, except that this time, I was gonna land without my father. About 10 seconds later, the automatic parachute went off, which meant that something was wrong. It must have been the way I fell out of the jet, I thought. It was going too fast, and I did not jump correctly. I was heading towards the earth without any idea where I might land. But when I looked underneath, all I could see was water everywhere. I honestly wasn't sure if I'd land in the sea, but I was hoping I wouldn't, because it was going to be a big problem. Before I knew it, I had hit the ocean. I had to act fast to avoid drowning. I remembered the instructions that said if you land in the water, you must get your chest strap off to take the gear off quickly and swim beneath the parachute. Even though I was panicking like crazy, I tried to calm myself down, because I really needed to focus on what I was doing. Otherwise, I wouldn't survive. It took me a while before I managed to focus on the way I was swimming. I was honestly scared to death that my feet would get tangled up in the parachute and drown me with it. When I looked around me, all I saw was water. No ships, no land, no people, nothing. I took my shoes off to help ease my movement, and I swam around towards where I thought could be the way to the island. But I realized after a while that there was no way for me to know if I was swimming in the right direction. At that moment, I started realizing that I was in much bigger trouble than I thought I was in. I can't even describe the feeling I had. I have never been more scared in my entire life. My body was tired. Swimming started to become exhausting, and I honestly wondered whether that was going to be my last day alive. Then a thought hit me. I remembered all of the adventures I had taken with my parents and how there were a lot of hard times. At that moment, I knew that feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get me anywhere. I needed to fight to stay alive. I never thought I would be put in that kind of situation. Well, to be fair, there were times that it had passed my mind, though I think everyone has had those kind of worst-case scenario thoughts, but never did I think of that. I thought about all the best ways to retain my energy. My biggest problem was that my body felt like lead. I didn't want to push myself too hard and sink to the bottom, so I decided to float for a while. However, with more time to think, more bad thoughts kept coming to mind. I was in the middle of the ocean. What if a shark came up from the water and decided to eat me? They could smell blood for miles, and their jaws could snap down on me quick. Even while I was floating, there would have been a shark creeping along the bottom of the ocean, just waiting for the right moment to attack. Needless to say, I was feeling uneasy. Even if it wasn't a shark, what if a freak storm hit and washed me further away from where my parents were looking? The weather around the island was supposed to be superb around this time of year, but that didn't mean the weather couldn't change at any moment. I knew deep down that it may have been illogical, but at that moment, logic seemed to be the last thing that made it to the top of my mind. I never felt so weak in my life. There was nothing I could control. If something went wrong all of the ways out here, I would end up dead, and my parents wouldn't even know what happened to me. I was out in the open with nothing to do but swim around, and I was hardly the fastest thing in the sea. There was no mistaking how vulnerable I was out there. So many thoughts that seemed to weigh me down more than my own tired body. I started to panic again and started to swim again, trying to do all I could to make some sort of safety fast. Then I thought better of it. I knew that I needed to calm down if I wanted to survive. The only thing I could do was wait. But if I used up all of my energy then and there, I wouldn't have any later in case I desperately needed it. I didn't know if there were any sharks around, but if there were, I would not go down without a fight. Those may have been empty words, but they made me feel better at the moment. I started thinking about other things. I wanted to fill the time by thinking about anything that would take my mind off of the situation that I was in. Lying there, looking up at the sky, I started to play little games in my mind. I looked at the clouds and found images in them. And then I would remember times that would fit with the image. I saw slopes and remembered how my family went skiing the year before. Skiing down the mountains and feeling the cold on my face while surrounded by the thick snow. The hot chocolate I drank when we all sat down in the lobby at the end of the day, and the fireplace in our room as we sat and played board games. It was one of my favorite memories of last year. The clouds started to drift through the sky, passing me by, on their way for their own adventure. I could see the sun start to dip in the sky, but I didn't know how much time had passed. My body was starting to ache all over. From hitting the water to swimming as hard as I could, I was pushing myself further than I ever had. The worst part was not knowing how much longer I would need to continue pushing. At that moment, I couldn't even panic. I was too tired to do anything else but float. Trying to do anything else would take too much energy. As the sun drifted lower in the sky, I thought how beautiful the orange glow over the water looked, and I started to wonder, would that be the last thing I saw before I died? When the sun had completely faded in the sky and the stars started to show, my body started to falter. I could feel myself dipping underwater and tried focusing all of my attention on staying afloat just a little longer. I could feel tears in my eyes, but they were covered by the water. I clenched my eyes shut tight, my mind once again drifting towards the negative. I wasn't going to be found. Maybe my parents were looking in the wrong place. And what if my swimming earlier was in the wrong direction and I made it harder on them? I started to come down on myself harder than I ever had before. I opened my eyes again and looked up at the stars. One stood out above all the rest. It was brightly reflected on the water, but when I looked up, I didn't see it. When the light got brighter and brighter, I realized that it wasn't a star, but a boat. I smiled to myself as it came closer to me. Then I used the last of my strength to scream out. As the boat came near, I could feel relief fill my body. I didn't know how long I was there, nor did I know if I would make it, but just being able to see help coming for me made all the difference in the world. The crew helped me up onto the boat and led me over to a small cot that they laid out for me. It wasn't until I was out of the water that I realized how cold I actually was. When they saw me shivering, they wrapped me up tight to fight off the cold night and headed off in the direction of the island. It was finally over. I was brought to the local hospital and waited for my parents to arrive. They fussed over me for quite some time, trying to make sure that I didn't have any cuts and bruises, and to make sure that I was rested and ate a nice meal. Even though I was surrounded by strangers, it felt good to be back on dry land again. When my parents burst into the room, I could see the worry on their faces. My body wasn't too beat up, but being in the ocean for so long made me look worse than I was. My dad immediately went to asking questions, trying to find out if there was anything wrong with me. My mom came to my bed and held me tight in her arms. I hugged her back, so happy to be near her again. When she finally let go, I could see that her eyes were red and puffy. My dad came over to me next and apologized for not getting there sooner and told me how he hired every available boat to search for me. I shook my head and gave him a hug too. I was just happy that he was there now. From then on, I knew not to take life for granted. Every moment is precious and should be spent appreciating everything that you have, because you never know when it may be gone. So yeah, call it bad luck or even a stupid mistake. I can't really argue with either one, but I'm just glad that it had a happy ending.
What's the worst thing that has ever happened to you in your part-time job? You may have been caught skipping a shift, made to do some horrible tasks, or maybe had a mean boss. Well, that is nothing compared to what happened at my work. I was framed for a crime that I didn't commit and almost ended up in jail. It was just a normal Saturday at work, and I was having to stand in one of the galleries, keeping an eye on the visitors and answering questions. The museum has finds from all over the world. There are rare statues, priceless jewelry, and mountains of gold coins. Some people might find museums boring, but there are some pretty impressive items there, and some of them are worth a lot of money. Part of my job involves walking around and making sure that nothing suspicious is going on. That day at work, there was a group of French tourists looking around. I heard them and recognized their accents straight away. I was so pleased to hear some real French people, and even better, I could understand a bit of what was being said. So I decided to follow them and listen in on their conversation. I hid behind a big Roman statue as they stood chatting, and I was so happy when I started to pick up some of their words. They were looking at some small glass vases on display and saying how impressive they were. Then, one of them said a word I remembered, but couldn't quite remember what it meant. It was voler. As I was listening in, one of them moved closer to a vase to take a photo of it, and they set off an alarm. It was so loud, everyone in the museum turned and looked. The poor tourists looked so embarrassed. They kept apologizing in French and English to me. I went over to the vase and reset the alarm. When I turned around, I saw the tourists running out of the museum. I was sad that they had left so quickly. I was hoping to listen in to more of their conversation. Perhaps they had been frightened by the alarm. It also bugged me that I couldn't think what one of the words were that they kept saying. Later that day, I was thinking about it, and I remembered what voler meant. It meant steal. I couldn't believe it. They were talking about stealing one of the vases. I stopped what I was doing and ran as fast as I could to the security guard's office. I knocked on the door and waited impatiently for him to let me in. Gary, the head of security, eventually opened the door. I rushed in and started garbling about the tourists and how I had followed them to listen into their conversation, and how I had been secretly learning French and hadn't told anyone, and how those tourists were planning to steal one of the vases. Gary listened to me intently. Then he told me not to worry. I was so angry. How could he not be worried? He told me to get back to work and that he would look into it. That afternoon, we were so busy that I soon forgot all about what had happened. At the end of my shift, I went to my locker and got my bag ready to go home. As I was heading out, one of the French tourists came back into the museum and approached me. He asked me for directions to the train station, but there was something shifty about him, and I didn't believe him. I thought he was back again to try and steal. was worth millions. I had no idea a vase could be worth so much. They told me that I was free to go, but there would be an investigation, and they would be searching my house for the vase. My parents turned up to collect me, and they were so angry. I tried to explain to them what had happened, but they didn't listen at all. When we got home, I went to my room as I was told, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out and prove my innocence, so I waited until I could hear my parents were busy, and I snuck out of the house. I could hear them shouting after me, but I ignored them and started to run. I headed to the train station as I knew I needed to catch those tourists before they left town with the vase. When I got to the station, it was really busy. It was rush hour and there were people everywhere. I went to the top of a staircase and looked around, studying the crowd. Then I saw them. The group of tourists were about to get on a train. I didn't know what to do next as I hadn't thought that far ahead, so I did the only thing I could think of. I pointed at them and shouted to everyone that they were thieves and needed to be stopped. But no one did anything. People just looked at me or walked past. So I carried on shouting, but it was too late. The tourists got onto the train and it pulled out of the station. I sank to the floor and started to cry. Then I heard someone calling my name. It was my parents. I couldn't believe they had found me. They ran up to me and I braced myself to be told off. They didn't shout at me though. If anything, they looked scared. They told me that I had been called to the police station and we had to go right away. The drive to the police station felt so long. I couldn't believe I was about to be arrested for a crime that I didn't do. When we got there, the police got me to sit in an interview room by myself. They kept me waiting for ages until a policeman came in and sat down. He told me that I was cleared of all charges. They had found the vase, and they knew I had nothing to do with stealing it. I asked them how they had caught the tourists when they were already on the train to leave the town. But he told me that he couldn't talk about it as they were still investigating. I was released and allowed to go home. My parents were in the waiting room, and my mom started crying when I saw her. They apologized so much for believing that I could have been a thief. As upset as I had been, I forgave them. They wanted to take me home, but I convinced them to drop me off at the museum first. I needed to speak to my boss about what had happened. When I got to the museum, I saw police cars outside. This didn't surprise me as they were still investigating, but then something really shocking happened. The police were bringing a man out of the museum in handcuffs, and it wasn't who I thought it would be. It was the security guard, Gary. They put him into one of the police cars, then drove off. I was so shocked. I didn't know what to do. He was so nice. And now it looked like he was the one being framed for the crime. Then I heard someone calling my name. It was my manager who came running out to speak to me. He told me that Gary hadn't been framed. Gary was the one who had stolen the vase. And to make it worse, he was the one who had tried to frame me. Apparently, when the police were investigating, they had found out that Gary had a criminal record and lied to get a job at the museum. They soon worked out that he had stolen the vase and erased the camera footage so no one would know it was him. He had stolen the vase, then went into my locker and hid the alarm in my bag, framing me for his crime. The tourist coming back to the museum and asking for directions was just a coincidence. I was so shocked. I would never have suspected him of being a criminal. He had seemed so trustworthy. That was a few weeks ago. And now things are back to normal. My job is going really well. My manager feels so guilty about what happened that he is super nice to me. He has even said that I can have as many shifts as I want when I come back from college in the holidays. But there was something that I couldn't stop thinking about. If the tourists were innocent, why were they using the word voler? I looked it up. I realized that the word can mean steal, but it could also mean to fly. That was when I realized what was on the vase. It was a picture of some birds in flight. That was what they had been talking about. I've realized I still have a way to go before I can say that I understand French. Have you ever jumped to a conclusion and it turned out you were really wrong? Or has something really bad happened to you in your job?